So it's not that looking at the whole gives you an advantage over any, type of new information that might be available to you. It's that it prevents you from employing a negative process of being distracted.
Welcome to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. In today's episode, I speak with Dr. Howie Carson about long-term player development. I hope you enjoy. I wanted to move on to the final paper, which is a very different topic than the other ones we've covered, titled Where You Look During Golf Putting Makes No Difference to Skilled Golfers, but What You Look At Might. I'll just hand the floor over to you and let you share what you'd like to share on that. I know we're changing gears, and after this we'll go back to there's a lot of insights here already if you're listening, but some insights you would have. But let's first start with just this paper.
Well, so this is a good example of a biopsycho interaction with this paper, so the physical and the psychological. So you'll probably be aware of Jordan Spieth and Louis Oosthuizen using a very unorthodox putting method, very successfully, I should add, some years ago, where they were looking at the hole during the execution of the putting stroke. And I had a Ph.D. student, David Moffat, who was focusing his Ph.D. on this area. And we did a study to try to we first of all identified a lot of gaps in the literature. So a lot of inconsistencies, things that had been missed out. To summarize the findings of a whole review paper, there wasn't anything with golfers who were skilled, and all of the research was done in the lab. So we needed to try to move the research on in a way that would try to help coaches working with skilled golfers, probably not the caliber of Jordan Spieth and Louis Oosthuizen, but people who used the traditional method of putting to good effect. What we also identified was that there was a lack of understanding as to why these golfers were being successful with this new approach, and understanding why it's working is something that's crucial to this "it depends" concept. Because if you don't know why something works, then it's difficult to be able to realize that it's important. So David ran a first study with skilled golfers, looking at them using what we call target-focused aiming, looking at the hole, or TFA, versus BFA, ball-focused aiming, looking at the ball. And he found that there was no difference. So these were people who had never used this novel approach before. They were good golfers, I think, from memory, 3 handicap golfers on average. And it made no difference to their putting on the real putting green. This was out in Portugal, from a distance of 8 feet, which is a meaningful conversion distance on the PGA Tour. So we were curious as to why putting with a different method resulted in no change in performance, because you would expect that the golfers would get worse. It's like if I told you to change your grip, ball striking would be all over the place. Yeah. So we were thinking that it would cause a dip in their performance, but it stayed identical. So the only reason, if you had the two conditions here, so we were expecting this performance to drop, but actually it stayed the same. So there's something happening in this process that is causing enough of a buffer to keep the performance level the same. And there are a number of explanations. It could be that turning your head to the side and looking at the hole gives you some kind of technical advantage in performing the movement. That's one hypothesis. But equally, it could be that what you're looking at, or what you're seeing, the information that you're taking in with your eyes, is somehow beneficial. I know you've read a lot of research on quiet eye, or this idea of an external focus of attention. And so you could rationalize, when I'm looking at the hole, I've got this external focus on where I need to putt to, or that the eye is fixed on the hole because that's processing information that's relevant to the task, where I'm going and how far away it is. Yeah. So it could be that the eye is fixed for this reason, because I'm extracting relevant information to the task during the execution. Equally, it could be that it changes somebody's focus. So it's nothing to do with the environmental information. It could be to do with their focus, okay, what they're thinking about. So we drew on some research, and I should say at this point, so Rosie Collins, another PhD student of ours, ran this study. So she led on the study. We ran an EEG study. So we used electrodes on the surface of the head, of the scalp, to look at the electrical activity in the brain, in different sections of the brain. And we drew on some research by Gavin Lowes in the late 1990s, who was interested in elite level pistol shooters. And he looked at best versus worst shots, and he also looked at elites versus sub-elites. And he was interested in the visual attention that was being applied at different phases of preparation to execute the shot. And what he found was that for the elites versus the sub-elites, and the best versus the worst, so whatever design you had, it was always the better shots versus the worst shots. He focused on the occipital lobe, which is at the back of the brain. So this is the center of the brain that processes visual information. Okay, and he was looking at a frequency, a signal called alpha. So alpha is a very slow wave. So if you have lots of alpha waves that are very slow, it shows that that part of the brain is less active. Okay, so think of it in terms of high frequency being very active, then slow waves being less active. And what he found was that at different time points in preparing to shoot, he looked at 6 seconds, 4 seconds, 2 seconds, shoot. Yeah, so the time course got closer to the shot. The amount of alpha waves increased. Okay, so as you got closer to doing the shot, the visual part of the brain became less engaged. And what he interpreted from this data was that a pistol shooter will transition from a state of attention. So I'm visually processing relevant information, so where the target is. Okay, but once I set up and I've adopted my posture, remember I'm an elite level pistol shooter, so I've employed the technique and I've got my aim, the target isn't moving. So why would I need to continuously process visual information? So the visual part of the brain starts to become less engaged. And then there's a transition to a state of from attention to what's called intention, which is when the person actively retrieves from memory the execution process. In this case, they're focusing on a smooth trigger pull, okay, which is really important in stabilizing the gun, okay, when you're talking about millimeters difference in success and failure at this 10-meter task. We use this idea to test whether when somebody looks at the whole, there is a benefit visually. So if the external focus idea, and quiet eye being that I'm actively processing visual information, is right, we would expect to see the visual part of the brain remain active. So we would expect the alpha power to be low as we got closer to the execution. And so what we did was we compared skilled golfers. So it was a long way round to get to the point of the study, but we compared skilled golfers performing whilst looking at the ball and looking at the hole for 8-foot and 15-foot distances. Okay, so we've got the two techniques. two different levels of challenge. Remember, pragmatic approach, because we know that depending on how difficult the task is, might make a difference, right? So we wouldn't assume that one size would fit all. So we did this on a natural putting green outside with a mobile EEG device, so backpack, mobile, battery powered, EEG cap on. And what we found was, first of all, so the same pattern occurred in general. So as you went from 6 seconds to 4 seconds to 2 seconds, when you putted the ball in the hole, regardless of what putting technique you were using, we saw an increase in the alpha power the closer you got to starting the movement. So it seems the same. Once you take your aim and you're in your stance and you're ready to putt, you don't need to process visual information. Okay?
Once you're in your stance, once you've set up to the ball.
Once you've set up to the ball, yeah, absolutely. So we're not saying you shouldn't be reading the green, you shouldn't have an external focus of attention ever, but it makes sense. Once you've read the green, you've lined up, you've got your aiming point.
You're just retrieving now. You're no longer.
That doesn't change, does it? Exactly. So you can then transition from a state of attention over there to intention inside. So we found that there was less visual engagement with the closer you got to actually performing the movement. Now, what was interesting, comparing the BFA with the TFA, was
ball
looking
focus and
target focus. Yeah, was when we looked at the putts that missed. So looking at the putts that missed, where we saw the biggest difference was in the longer putts, the 15-foot putts. With the putts that missed, for the target focus, we saw a low, low, high signal of alpha. So they were still disengaging visually. But when we looked at the ball-focused aiming condition, the alpha power remained the same, which meant that the visual system was still actively engaged. Now, we can suggest from this data that the only difference here is what the person's looking at. So looking at the ball and the putter and your hands in your visual field could be a source of distraction, which could explain why they missed. Whereas when you look at the hole, you can't see those features. So they won't visually distract you. So what you're able to do is to maintain the process of attention to intention. So it's not that looking at the whole gives you an advantage over any, type of new information that might be available to you. It's that it prevents you from employing a negative process of being distracted. Okay. So what we could interpret, so there's a lot of research done on quiet eye. And imagine the visual system, so it goes from here to the back of the brain. Okay. So the quiet eye research is looking here, but they haven't traced the process back to the visual cortex. Mm-hmm. So you could make an assumption based on the eye movements when it becomes fixed, that it's fixed because it's engaging with the information in the visual field. Mm. So, the whole is important to look at. So we fixate on that, and that somehow gives us information. But when you look further back in the brain, actually we found at the time when the quiet eye would have been set off, actually there was less visual engagement. So the quiet eye could be a byproduct of the visual system shutting down or not processing information rather than it processing information. Now, we did attempt to get eye tracking at the same time as the EEG, but doing that outside is a massive challenge anyway because of the light conditions, and doing it with the EEG just didn't work. So you could follow that study up with a quiet eye, with an eye tracking and EEG measure, but for the moment we only have the EEG data. But it seems to suggest that certainly for putting tasks, at least with a fixed target, the quiet eye period is characterized by low engagement of the visual cortex.
So, and from practical perspective, that's the main insight, or is there also a matter of saying looking at the target is not good versus is good?
Well, okay, so there are two things. So first of all, so that's the second study that we did that found that there was no difference in the putting outcome, first of all. So it seems that for skilled golfers, using target-focused aiming, give it a go. It shouldn't make you any worse. Now, it might be that following a period of learning, and we're yet to do this, because this was just the first time they'd used target-focused aiming. If you were to practice with target-focused aiming, then what's to say that that wouldn't actually improve your putting?
Because there's less distractions, potentially?
Because there's less distractions, yeah. Now, it might not be for everybody. It might be just for those golfers who are easily distracted or who haven't got the ability to use their attentional control. We've spoken about all this layering and all of these components. Yeah, so it's not to say it's useful for everybody and nobody should be looking at the ball anymore. If you've got good control of that retrieval process, so I don't know about you, but when putting myself, I'm often focusing on the smooth sensation of moving my shoulders and hands together to initiate the type of pendulum movement that I'm looking for. But if you've not got good control over that and you find that you start worrying about or attending to things external, such as, club face position or, hand position.
Doubting your line,
doesn't look
double checking.
Exactly. So that's when you'll start to see the visual system becoming more active because it's not shutting off to enable that memory retrieval process.
I guess for me that makes more sense now. I was slightly confused on the fact that despite maintaining your sight on the hole, there was still a reduction in the visual. Even though you're visually focused on that, the visual system of the brain was not as active.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember who the female golfer is on tour who putts with her eyes closed. Same thing. She's extremely successful and she's not even looking. So where you look doesn't necessarily make a difference, but what you look at might. Could be the same just looking up. But we do need to do, there is scope for more studies. There were some limitations with the study, of course, as there always are, and we state those in the paper. But it is our intention to follow this chain of studies to try to develop, our understanding.
That's very interesting. And again, like what you said, there's obviously room for more research on that, but at least an understanding that interesting to see that looking at the target, the hole versus the ball, at worst doesn't make you necessarily a worse putter for high skilled players.
For these golfers, it didn't make any difference. So you can see there. So this is a biopsycho interaction.
Yeah.
The physical is I've changed my technique, but actually that's impacted on what's happening here.
Mm-hmm. And so for players that are looking around and or getting distracted, if we were measuring, that would probably be reflected in more activation in this part of the brain, which would mean lower levels of that alpha wave.
Yeah. So you would see lower occurrence of a slow wave.
Right. Well, the next section I wanted to go into basically was practical insights from all this, but I think the majority of that was already very, very practical. So I don't know if you had anything necessarily you wanted to add, not from that paper, but from anything we've talked about. At least from me, I'll start with that putting piece. There's a lot of practical insights there to potentially explore with putting. Long-term planning, the importance of that. Then we touched on what's your intended impact as a coach and as a player. And it's all related to the fact that long-term planning, and then we touched on the different layers or phases of this technique, housekeeping essentially, and having to plan those different parts out. And without a long-term plan or some sort of structure, it's difficult to actually achieve that. Those are the things that stuck out to me. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add that we hadn't touched on before we close.
I think, my key message, and Dave Collins and I published a piece in the PGA magazine. I don't know if you get it, but it's for the PGA of Great Britain and Ireland, a piece that says it's called "It Depends." The single most useful piece of information for coaches. And so my advice for both players and coaches is that understanding is a crucial component to learning techniques and learning skills, but also making decisions. So understanding why you're doing what you're doing, all of a sudden is the underpinning of quality practice. We know that good players do good quality practice, but their needs might be different to your needs. So understanding the rationale behind what they're doing gives you a better ability to tailor what you need to do. So don't just copy because so-and-so is doing this. Understanding, why they're doing it and why you need to do it. That's really the single simplest yet most complex piece of advice, I think, in the whole coaching domain.
Understanding why you're doing something.
Yeah, but it's exciting because it then opens up. Once you start to understand different outcomes, it's not just correcting technique. Maybe it's actually layering in different factors of that affect performance. The person might have good technique, but not able to control that technique under pressure. So once you start understanding the different outcomes that you could be working towards with a player, then you start to open up the creativity of being a coach, because you can then tailor their training to meet their needs. We talk a lot about individualized practice, and one size doesn't fit all. But actually, we need to start understanding what these mean, as a systematic approach at those different levels: the big level, the phases level, and then within the session level. And that's where we're going with the research. It's really exciting working with practitioners. And really shedding a light on the difficult challenges that players and coaches face. I always say to people that, certainly coaches, we're standing up for the difficult task that you have in front of you. It's not as simple as do this or that. That's wrong. You've got to think a lot about your professional practice, and that takes a lot of hard work. But we're getting there. So planning and understanding your client really are the first steps, Absolutely. I would say, to becoming a more effective coach.
I love that. And to conclude, I want to finish on, are there any projects? I know you're obviously working on a lot of things, but are there any things you wanted to share or share insights into what you were working on? And then the follow-up to that would be, are there any books that you're interested in, that you enjoy, that you're interested in sharing with listeners?
Sure. I would say, my research, as you can probably imagine, with this interdisciplinary view, and please have a look at my profile. You'll see the publications. You can see the scope of work, but it's pretty broad. In terms of golf, we've got a nice new collaboration with Charles University in Prague, looking at sort of aspects of skill execution and learning in beginner level golfers. So I'd probably say look out for that type of work. That will shine a light on this individualized approach that we've just been talking about today, in terms of beginner golfers learning to play golf and what they think they're doing, or their interpretation of a lesson compared to what the coach was actually trying to deliver. I've done some recent work last year that we're looking to submit for review with the medical staff on the DP World Tour, looking at wrist injury mechanisms. So that, again, might be of interest to people. We've been looking at sort of EMG forearm activity for different types of clubs and the susceptibility to injury caused by a particular tendon that attaches through the forearm. So that's potentially something of interest. We've got some more stuff in golf coaching and sort of golf development in terms of coach education coming out with Stephen Orr, and also some work in dance. So this is an area of work that I've recently been introduced to since moving up to Edinburgh through a colleague of mine, Dr. Wendy Timmons. She's introduced me to a very different world than golf. But we've been looking at, do you remember I mentioned the sort of psychological and social characteristics? We call them PCDEs, psychological characteristics for developing excellence. So these are the sorts of things that help people to get the most out of experiences. It's not just the doing the skills, hitting the golf ball, doing the dance training. Actually, there's a lot of difficulty involved in a performance pathway, and being able to seek support from somebody, have a realistic expectation, use goal setting. There's lots of these characteristics that help people to manage themselves through difficult times. And we've been looking at the case of COVID in the dance talent development pathway between those that coped well with a lot of the challenges and those that didn't. And it's revealing some really nice findings that golf coaches, I think would find interesting in terms of preparing their players to take on, difficult challenges. Could be injury, could be COVID. A lot of us couldn't play during COVID. Could be making a swing change, and making sure that somebody has the right sort of attitude and ability to get through that challenge is really important. So there's lots going on. My work I always make publicly available through, I don't know if you know ResearchGate.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So it's a free site that people can either download your research as it was published, depending on a lot of the licensing laws. But if not, so if we can't put the final version of the article up for you, we'll put what's called the author's accepted manuscript, which is essentially the Microsoft Word version of our research. So you'll be able to download exactly what was printed, just not in the same format or with the pictures and colors, essentially. So, check that out, and people are more than welcome to download and this work and contact me if they wish.
And I'll include all the links as well to your ResearchGate page as well.
Perfect. Oh, in terms of books, I'll be honest with you, I'm not a massive book reader. I do tend to go for the journal articles, just because access to that information happens much earlier than in books. But there is one book that I have found really sort of significant to my development, especially early on when I was doing my coach training, because there are lots of ideas out there, as you know, and it can get confusing. And that's this one here. So it's called Coach's Guide to Teaching Sports Skills, and it's by Bob Christina and Daniel Korkos. And Bob Christina was a real pioneer of doing practical research, and he sort of challenged a lot of esteemed academics in the 1970s and 80s. And he was saying that we needed to go back to doing research that made a difference. And it's a really good book for I'm not going to say simplifying the coaching process, but it helped me to make sense of what I might be doing as a coach with a client. And it gave me a good structure to try and interpret my readings against. So I'd recommend that book to particularly people starting out in coaching. some of the sort of theoretical ideas, it is from, I think, 1988. Some of the theoretical ideas have moved on, but it gives lots of examples of good coaching practice. So that's what I would recommend.
Great. I love that. That's a book I haven't come across, so we'll also include a link to that and look into that. Well,
and because it's very old, it's very cheap as well. So I know some of these books are over £100.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think this is probably about $2.99.
Awesome.
So,
well, I really enjoyed this thorough conversation. Touched on a lot of topics, and I'm really interested to see the work that you're going to be publishing in the future, because I think it's so valuable. And for anyone listening, there's a lot of valuable pieces of information that they can consider and reflect on and really use in their own coaching or in their own player development. So, Dr. Carson, I really appreciate your time today.
No problem. Thank you so much for hosting me.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to the Golf Performance newsletter. This is where I share written, audio, and video content designed to help golfers take their game to the next level. All the relevant links from today's episode and to the newsletter can be found below. See you next time.